Hi, I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Inez Stepman in for Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. So as usual, we have a very wide-ranging, diverse show to bring to you today. We're obviously very grateful to Inez for filling in for Rachel here. So Ben is going to tee us off by talking about the latest in the Durham probe. We have an indictment with respect to Russiagate. I will then talk about a very exciting or potentially exciting pact in the Indo-Pacific between the US, the UK, and Australia. Emily is then going to talk about what is just a catastrophic, by all accounts, crisis at the southern border, especially happening in my former state of Texas. And then Inez will close us out by talking about critical race theory and First Amendments and teachers' rights and just the lingering controversy that probably will not go away, probably for years at this point. But without further ado, Ben, why don't you kick us off here?
Thanks. So the Durham probe has finally yielded some fruit in the way of this indictment of Michael Sussman. Michael Sussman was a lawyer at Perkins Coie representing the Clinton campaign, the DNC, and others. And essentially, he was indicted for a single count of misrepresenting himself to the general counsel of the FBI when he brought the general counsel of the FBI, James Baker, information regarding nefarious ties between the Trump campaign and the infamous Russian Alpha Bank. Baker claimed, or at least the testimony given with respect to this interaction suggests that Sussman represented himself as basically a good citizen just reaching out to the general counsel of the FBI to make this claim of potentially nefarious relations between the Trump campaign and a Russian Alpha Bank. Baker claimed at the time that he couldn't remember really whether or not Sussman himself had identified the fact that he was actually on the payroll of the Clinton campaign and it appears was billing for the time associated with him going to the general counsel with these allegations. And of course, obviously, if you're going to the FBI general counsel, being paid by an opposing campaign to spread potential dirt of the most nefarious and serious kind, of course, this is a major, major misrepresentation. And the indictment is worth reading in full in and of itself because it shows you the way in which Sussman himself sat at the nexus between a couple of different Russiagate efforts, one of which being the Alpha Bank narrative piece and another being his ties to CrowdStrike, which, of course, was the private firm that investigated the DNC hack and claimed that they assessed that it was Russia that had hacked the DNC server, did not allow the FBI to investigate itself, that server, but of course, ultimately found that there was actual no clear evidence that Russia had, in fact, hacked the DNC in the first place. Sussman was tied into CrowdStrike. Sussman was tied into Steele and his infamous dossier. So he's a central player at the nexus between seeding the federal government with these allegations and then also working the media, which is a whole another part of this indictment. And we don't need to go into all the gory details of the ways in which these types of stories were seeded and this misrepresentation claimed in the indictment. But a couple points worth making. First of all, the Durham probe itself is set to lapse at the end of this month unless Attorney General Merrick Garland appropriates further funding for it. So I think that's an important point in terms of the tick-tock and the timeline of the probe. Secondly, the statute of limitations was about to expire with respect to these misrepresentation charges. So that would be another reason why this indictment might have been brought. But I want to set aside for a moment the Russiagate aspect of this, and it is damning what transpired here in the way of these stories being seeded and then further the FBI not really investigating seriously the fact that where was this story coming from and did it have merit? And then, of course, it being spun out to the media and this circularity between leaking things to federal officials, leaking things to the press and trying to create a narrative that ultimately was, by the way, propagated by Hillary Clinton herself just several days before the election. And then the whole scandal of the media itself, not even talking about the fact they were completely played and didn't do their job in investigating these allegations. To my mind, the real story is this, and I don't think this has been argued widely. Sussman is the fall guy here, but Sussman is a non-government official. This is basically the federal government saying, a private citizen came to us with misrepresentations, and as a consequence, we went down the Russiagate rabbit hole. But that absolves the federal government itself of its laughable effort not to deeply investigate where these allegations were coming from. And then when they clearly knew that these allegations fell, to continue the Russiagate/Spygate effort. And so to my mind, that is the real takeaway from the indictment. Thus far, no one in the government has paid a price, a legal price, for their dirty dealings with respect to Russiagate/Spygate, with the exception of Kevin Kleinsmith, who doctored an email and ultimately got less than a slap on the wrist as a consequence. Last point worth noting that is interesting in all this is that Sussman himself worked for the federal government in the DOJ, I believe, for 12 years. So he was a government player himself. That's the only reason he was able to reach out to a James Baker, FBI general counsel, and have this kind of meeting in the first place. It is interesting that a former member of the national security and foreign policy or law enforcement establishment was the fall guy, it appears, in this case. But still, I believe the takeaway is that it's not a government official who's facing an indictment here from the Durham probe. It's someone outside the federal government. So with that, I kind of open the floor. What are your impressions of this indictment? And do you think this overarching argument has merit?
Yeah, I'm happy to take first crack at this one. I mean, Ben, you've been all over the Russiagate story since day one, so I don't pretend to be quite up to date with all the intricate details as you are on this. But this obviously was from day one a Clinton campaign operation. We obviously all knew that, going back to the Steele dossier and Fusion GPS, and the entire story reeked of Clinton provenance since day one here. And I guess the fact that the indictment here, and you're correct to use the term fall guy, that's obviously what's going on here now. We are 5 years past the 2016 election. We are many moons past when some of these indictments should have been handed out, when some of the congressional subpoenas and hearings should have made people inside the government themselves publicly culpable. So I think fall guy is the accurate term to use here. But look, the Wall Street Journal editorial board basically talked about how this just underscored the fact that the Clinton apparatus was behind this from day one here. I think that basically is my takeaway as well. I think a fair and just media, which we obviously do not have, I'm doing my very small part to try to make us a little more fair and just, would view it through that prism as well here. But there's all sorts of distortions here. I mean, I've seen some headlines about this story from MSNBC, New York Times, all the usual actors, just trying to kind of just bury this in the sand, pretend like it's no big deal. It's like bizarre. Why is this happening? All of that. But we're running a little short in the segment, so I don't want to steal up too much of Inez's and Emily's time. I don't really have a whole lot to add to what you said here, but just to kind of emphasize the overarching point, it really does just accentuate just the complete rottenness, the general awfulness that was the Clinton campaign and all that they were trying to do during that time here. And he is a fall guy. It really, in a just world, should be much more people, both inside and outside the government, who are culpable, being dragged before Congress, all sorts of kind of penalties. But for now, a modicum solace, I think, for those of us who have been sounding the alarm on this since day one.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would only add to that the people who are always talking about norms, right? We've had this whole screeching sort of conversation, democracy dies in darkness, around the norms of democracy, which all too often folks in the media and in both parties in Washington have mistaken what are essentially political agreements or quote unquote norms of the last 30 years, the post-Cold War period. They've mistaken those sort of gentlemen's agreements for the actual norms of liberal democracy all too often. Here we actually see two parallel stories where we are talking about truly breaching the norms of a liberal democracy. One is to use foreign intelligence services to spy and play politically in the United States, apparently in collusion with one political campaign. That is a true breach of a norm in a liberal democracy, in any stable democracy. And the second, of course, that we're not going into today, but the General Milley story about apparently a pattern of defying civilian control over the military and over the ultimate policymaking decisions over the U.S. military. That is not just a liberal democratic norm. That's And that's a norm of any stable country that claims in any way to have legitimate rule by the people, is that the military is under control of the sovereign that is the people and not the military itself. That is a really serious norm. And it's funny to me that neither of these two stories is getting the kind of play that, of course, Russiagate initially did, right? Because these are real breaches of democratic norms that I think are extremely serious.
This is also a major journalistic failure, just to wrap this all up. I mean, it's actually pretty amazing how this story first made its way onto Slate, and then it was amplified in other places, not just Slate. You can look at so many case studies from the entire Russiagate saga, and the more that we learn as the investigations into that original investigation continue, the more we see how easily journalists were taken by paid political operatives, despite the fact, like in this case, experts said, this is not possible. Like, there are so many explanations for what you're seeing with this server that could be, like, the bulk of the likely explanations are not nefarious. And again, the story just jumped and sort of became canon in the narrative, despite all of the myriad problems. And so journalists are not the bulwark between elites and the public and power that they should be, because they're so easily manipulated and taken by those people in power. And Russiagate is a case study in that, and this is a microcosm of that case study.
All right, so let's, Ben, is there anything else you want to add to this before we move on?
The last thing I was thinking is just thinking about analogies here. This is like there were so many different variants of the Russiagate virus, and yet we're still infected by it over 5 years in.
I like that analogy. We're probably on like Lambda or like Pi or Omicron variant of the Russiagate scandal at this point, right? If I can go back to my old Greek alphabet days. All right, well, let's move on here. So one of the biggest geopolitical stories, probably the biggest international geopolitical story over the past week and a half or so, with potentially huge ramifications, it's way too early to tell, obviously, is this trilateral security agreement between three Anglosphere countries, that of course being the US, the UK, and Australia, where the US and UK, which are two of the currently only 6 countries, in addition to China, Russia, India, and France, that have nuclear power submarines, have essentially made a pact with Australia and their Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, whose prime minister name, by the way, President Joe Biden appears to have forgotten this past weekend in all of his doddering senility, but that's a whole nother story. The US and UK have agreed to partner with Australia to provide them with nuclear powered submarines here. Now, at face value, that doesn't necessarily mean the submarines are readily equipped with nuclear warheads in tow. It just means that they are quite literally powered by a nuclear reactor, but these submarines are potentially capable of having nuclear weaponry affixed to them. It's a big deal for many reasons, and we should probably just start to kind of dive into what those many reasons are. First of all, let's just first talk about France a little bit here. So Australia had been in negotiations with France to kind of build off of French technology to build non-nuclear, I think, kind of standard boilerplate diesel operated submarines. France, by the way, which again is one of those 6 countries that currently has nuclear powered submarines, was just so taken aback by the fact that the US and UK decided to ally in this trilateral agreement, and France felt snubbed by it that they weren't included in it, that they took the quite literally historically unprecedented step of actually recalling their ambassador from the United States and from Australia. France obviously is quite literally America's oldest ally, going back to the Revolutionary War. They, of course, gave us the Statue of Liberty. As somewhat of a, personally speaking, as somewhat of an Anglophile and kind of a chauvinist in all things US, UK, Anglosphere related, I don't have a huge bone to pick with necessarily, but it is interesting to note that it is one of the biggest rifts in American-French diplomacy, quite literally ever. And I think 5-6 years ago, if you had said that there would be a French government recalling their ambassador from Washington, D.C., people would say, oh, my God, what did President Trump do? Well, it actually happened under President Joe Biden. So let's kind of put that in the back, and maybe we'll come back to that a little later. A couple other things to note about what's going on here. There's the geopolitical chessboard aspect of this, obviously. So when President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, and Prime Minister Morrison, in all of their public comments, on this have not officially, explicitly made reference to China and the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping and all of their kind of hegemonic territorial ambitions there in the Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. But that is obviously what this is about. That is transparently what this is about. I think some State Department people in Foggy Bottom have made reference to that. You really do not have to look very far to realize this is clearly about China. So I guess from my perspective, I would analogize what looks here like the seminal beginnings of kind of a U.S. bolstered alliance here in the Indo-Pacific centered around Australia as being pretty analogous actually to the Abraham Accords, because from my perspective, what's going on here, the same way that the U.S. is kind of instrumental in helping allies kind of come closer together in the Middle East to contain the overarching threat of Iran. So here we're doing the same thing with China. And when we discuss foreign policy over and over again on this show and what kind of like a middle way foreign policy between kind of neoconservative and isolationist extremists might look like, personally, I have often kind of championed the Abraham Accords like it's a peak example of what this can look like in practice, helping kind of countries come together to better contain and maintain operational control over an area and then provide a deterrent threat or a deterrence posture against an enemy. That seems like what's happening here. So let's give credit where credit is due here. It does seem to be President Biden's, from what I can tell, by far the best thing he's done in office. Admittedly, there's not a whole lot to choose from there, but this obviously is an unambiguously good thing, I think, from my perspective. I think it's difficult to argue with that unless you're kind of like a genuine Francophile and you put U.S.-French relations on such a pedestal here. But there's obviously just a lot to unpack here in general. I don't really want to take up too much more time, so I'm happy to just open the floor. What are your thoughts on this? Should we be a little bit more concerned about the U.S.-French rift than I'm kind of making it out to be? Is this just a good thing vis-a-vis China? Just happy to open it up.
I'll jump in and say I've been a skeptic of President Biden's China policy from day one. I've written a couple articles and then I've been keeping a running list of all the demerits with respect to China policy. So I'm as skeptical of any move as one can be. But in this case, on its face, at a minimum, you can't deny it's a positive thing to be seeking to build this sort of pact and bolster relations in a whole slew of ways with Quad-related countries. And actually this week, I believe President Biden is supposed to have an in-person Quad meeting, the Quad, of course, being Japan, India, Australia, the U.S., not the UK. Of course, this AUKUS agreement is sort of more of an Anglosphere focused agreement. I would have liked to see a further incorporation of Japan and India if I was going to nitpick it. With respect to the nuclear armed submarines and the like, this will be years off. So in some ways, it is more stylistic than substantive from a timeline perspective. But all that said, bolstering these relations is imperative. A real transition to the Indo-Pacific itself is imperative. And it's worth noting in the reporting on this agreement, supposedly the three countries have also agreed to share information. I'm quoting here from an AP or a Reuters article in areas including artificial intelligence, cyber, underwater systems, and long-range strike capabilities. One of the sources said, as part of the pact, the U.S. and Britain would share their knowledge of how to maintain nuclear defense infrastructure. So from my perspective, that's all to the good, with the one caution beyond the fact that the timeline is quite long on this. And leaving aside the hilarity of the Biden administration talking about the U.S. being back and wanting to work with our allies and partners, and then snubbing the French in a way that elicited this sort of hysterical reaction from the French and may have created a rift in the EU, which would be interesting to see the Biden administration try to explain the way in which the optics that they used in coming to this agreement. Josh's point about the fact that administration officials have been at pains to say that this is about China also goes back to talking points around the last meeting of the Quad several months back, a digital meeting in that case, where administration officials several times when asked by media figures, said this is not about any one country, i.e. this isn't specifically about China. That does concern me when it comes to this agreement, because even if that is just posturing, if you have rhetorical ambiguity or equivocation there that often either bleeds into the policy or is a reflection of the policy at core. And of course, you have the schizophrenia of the administration talking about wanting to work endlessly with China with respect to climate, the least positive custodian of the climate in the world. So all that said, a little bit of hesitation, but on its face, this is a very good thing.
I don't have a ton to add. I'll just say I do think on its face it seems to be a good thing, because I mean there have been a million complications in this sort of area for a long time, and so I really actually don't disagree with anything that's been said. I think there's a lot of ways to see this positively, and since we're running short on time in this, and I especially underscore Josh's point about France as our oldest ally and the importance of that in this context. So since we're running a little short on time, I'll kick it over to Inez.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, Emily, I don't have a ton to add. I think everyone who has read my work in general knows that I focus on domestic policy. I do think it's interesting, the shift from big international bodies that clearly have not functioned. If they ever did, they haven't functioned well in decades, to unilateral or trilateral or quadrilateral agreements between country to country. I do think that that's probably that until we build new, I guess, institutions that can actually name the enemy, to Ben's point, that can state their purpose as being explicitly aligned against China in what is looking like it's going to be a more bipolar world than those of us who are 90s babies are used to. I think it's interesting that those kinds of agreements, as Josh cited, the Abrahamic Accords, like these kinds of agreements that are popping up outside of those large international structures like the EU, like the UN. I think that's probably a commentary on how sclerotic really those organizations have become over time, if they ever weren't.
Yeah, let me just make a really quick point and toss it over to Emily to talk about the crisis, and it is a crisis at the southern border here. Ben raised India and Japan. I'm somewhat of an unapologetic Japanophile. I've been to Japan numerous times here. I've always had like a weird thing for Japanese culture. I just love that country. The Japanese military has been effectively non-existent since World War II, and it just seems from my perspective that the time for that as a kind of a pro-Western, pro-US, pro-Europe, whatever strategic idea has long passed here. And I was kind of hoping that President Trump might encourage Japan to rebuild its military posture, especially vis-a-vis Chinese deterrent. But I totally just want to underscore Ben's point here that if we want to take the foundation for this kind of NATO of the Indo-Pacific, which this potentially could emerge as, I think Japan, and ideally, obviously Taiwan, but one step at a time, but really Japan, I think would be like the logical next place to go next. But without further ado, let's transition to Emily in the southern border.
Well, we're filming this on Monday, and some horrifying images emerged over the weekend of an estimated 14,000 people, migrants, mostly from Haiti, we're told, who are camping in terrible conditions and squalor under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas, hoping to migrate into the United States. We're already at 1.5 million people migrants who have crossed the southern border into the United States this year. 200,000 last month alone. Now, Del Rio is a town of 36,000 people. It is one of the places on the border where we continue to see a large wave of people from Central America coming across the border. It's obviously extremely important to note that Haiti is in a state of, Haiti sadly is perpetually in a sort of tragic state. But in this case, they had the political destabilization, the assassination of the president, and also a terrible earthquake that has caused immense suffering in a country that has been suffering seemingly for decades, and particularly over the past 2 decades. So it is entirely understandable why, as so many of the migrants have told reporters who are asking them about their journey as they are camped under this bridge in Del Rio, they felt they had to take the chance. That's the quote of one woman who was interviewed. I believe she was a mother. She said she felt she had to take the chance. And here we have the decision on the part of the United States, which is not treated as a decision, right? It's treated as sort of reflexive. There's nothing we can do when this happens. And there are now images of Border Patrol agents on horseback with whips that the left is predictably sort of upset over. But what I think we need to talk about is the options that are before us. The pain in Haiti is on the left, from the left perspective, the only argument in favor of resettling absolutely everybody who wants to be resettled into the United States, and to do it, to allow it with a porous border, as in people just basically walking across with little vetting and then being taken care of. This is not, of course, efficient. This is also not how a country, a healthy country, operates. That's actually quite outrageous that your borders would intentionally be porous. And again, if we could resettle the entire country of Haiti, right, that's everybody in Haiti seemingly has a claim to asylum because of what's happening in their country. And the reality is that we cannot continue to incentivize, as this administration has done, as the political establishment has done, as the left intends to continue doing, incentivizing people making these perilous journeys and then resettling in communities that are already impoverished, are already buckling under the weight of problems, infrastructural problems, and I mean that in terms of poverty and everything, not climate infrastructure, as the left might say, or human infrastructure. But we don't have the ability to just sort of take care of this. It's not it's sadly not in our ability right now to take care of all of these 14,000 people under this bridge in Del Rio. And part of the reason we can't have these conversations is because the left takes any dispute that our policies are incentivizing a humanitarian crisis that we are not equipped to take care of and that we cannot solve with the wave of a hand. Any disagreement to that is treated as racism, and we can't have that conversation. So I'm curious for the group's thoughts right now on the images coming out of Del Rio and what they mean for this country.
So I'll jump in here. First, a very quick note. Emily, you pointed to the history of Haiti and the continual unrest, poverty, and disaster that comes out of Haiti. Worth noting that there are a lot of woke college professors who point to Haiti as a model for what they would call racial justice, right? That model of racial vengeance has not worked out well for Haiti. But of course, they have their explanation, just like they have with the collapse of Venezuela. It's not socialism, right? It's U.S. imperialism. But it's quite clear that model of racial vengeance has not done anything good for Haiti or its citizens. So that's first. But second of all, these images underscore not just the fact that, of course, the Biden administration has de facto open border policies. Of course, they reversed several Trump policies that discouraged some of these crossings, and it's not an accident that this border crisis has exploded as the administration's turned over. These migrants do have friends and family in the United States, and they're telling them that if they can make it across the border, functionally, they will be able to stay in the United States. And that is what's driving this crisis on the border. But just a larger point beyond even the policy, we don't have a real negotiating partner in Mexico. Mexico, increasingly, the Mexican government cannot really control what is a cartel-controlled smuggling operation running the entire length of the border of the United States. And I think it's really important to realize what kind of negotiating partner we actually are in. Even if Trump, for example, could force a couple concessions from the Mexican government, fundamentally, they can't give us that many concessions because there are large swaths of territory in northern Mexico that are de facto not controlled by the government. So we need to start thinking about what a fruitful, even with a serious administration, what it would look like to actually secure our southern border. And that likely means that we are going to have to, essentially police stuff on the other side of our national border, which is a huge problem, fraught like diplomatically, obviously, geopolitically, but that is actually a huge ongoing crisis that isn't going to be solved just by firmer immigration policies, although it will help and prevent these kinds of horrific images and surges that we're seeing. But the problem with the border is ongoing under different administrations. So even if we Hawks, sort of got everything we wanted on immigration policy and enforcement, the problem is fundamentally that we are living next door to what is increasingly looking like a failed narco state with a 2,000-mile border with us. So that is a major foreign policy crisis and border crisis for the United States, regardless of our internal immigration policy.
And arguably several failed narco states below it. So
really well said by Inez. I will be very brief in response because she said a lot of what I wanted to say there. Just real quick, just three extremely quick points. One is just underscoring this point that Mexico is a failed narco state. That's exactly the right term to use that. And that's exactly what Mexico has been for decades now. I moved to Miami recently. There's actually there's a larger Mexican population in Texas where I used to live, but there's a decent sized Mexican kind of diaspora here in Miami as well. And I've actually talked with some people since moving here, and a lot of them are from Mexico City. And Mexico City apparently itself has nothing to do with the cartels. The cartels don't really operate in that part of Mexico, but that northern part of Mexico, along like that massive border stretch, really kind of focusing more so than anything along the Mexican-Texas border, really is just completely cartel overrun here. So failed state is the way to describe it. Trump had this ingenious idea, of course, to kind of directly negotiate with the Guatemalan government, trying to shut down the Guatemala-Mexico border. Of course, Biden has reversed the Remain in Mexico policy, which border agents said was the single most effective anti-legal immigration tool that the former administration did. So Biden has been completely backwards on this. Second point, real quick. Look, where is Greg Abbott? Greg Abbott, a lot of my friends in Texas, a lot of Texas conservatives say that he talks the talk, but does not walk the walk. I think that's basically accurate here. Greg Abbott really, this is a legitimate crisis, not just for the illegal migrants who are being shepherded across the border by these drug cartels and these horrific actors, which are oftentimes in bed with Hezbollah and lots of jihadist elements as well here. But it's a total crisis for Texans who live near the border there, all the way obviously in the Rio Grande Valley, really all the way out to El Paso in the west. And I think a conservative governor of a large, powerful red state like Texas really should be doing more tangibly on the ground to secure that border with respect to the National Guard and things like that as well. So I had a final point, but I'm going to just shelve it because we're running low on time here, and I want to save some time for Ben.
Yeah, just really briefly, I agree. The point is imperative about the fact that we have several failed narco states to our south, and that is going to become a massive national security issue, and already is a national security issue. And that's actually kind of my main point, which is that the dereliction of duty by the Biden administration here, not only not defending the borders, but essentially cheering on their being overrun at a very minimum, of course, encouraging illegal immigration and then doing nothing to defend the border after that encouragement, that inducement itself should be an impeachable offense. Of course, it won't be, because impeachment is a political remedy and there's no political will, period, full stop. But also, we're still in a pandemic, right? So why aren't there massive draconian shutdowns of the border and then forced vaccination of anyone who dares come over by this administration? I mean, we would think that that's the case since we're in a public health crisis. Right. So to me, this is a super spreader event, and then also an absolute national security crisis, because who knows how many terrorists, gang members, cartel members, et cetera, are flooding over our borders while this is transpiring. And then, of course, there's, as I always harp on, the foreign interference aspect of this, which is that every illegal alien unleashed into the country ultimately does get counted in terms of our population numbers. And that does impact the allocation of congressional seats, redistricting, how hundreds of billions of dollars are doled out. So this is one massive crisis after another. And the last point I'll make is it is remarkable to me that the FAA barred Fox News from flying a drone over Del Rio. It's like they're not doing their duty to defend the border, and you are not allowed to report on it. That was very clearly the shot that was fired by the FAA. I understand they relinquished, and now Fox is allowed to fly a drone over Del Rio to produce images so that Americans can see what's actually going on their border. But just remarkable, the obfuscation of this administration that's completely derelict in its duty to put the life and limb of American citizens first.
What have you got for us, Inez?
Yeah, first, I just say I'm really glad you mentioned that about the drone and about the media, Ben. I think it's a really critical point about the FAA grounding those drones. But I am going to bring up as our last roundtable topic a poll that the Manhattan Institute recently put out, which shows strong majorities, and you can see the poll up here when we release it, strong majorities of parents of all racial backgrounds basically rejecting concepts from within critical race theory. So the phrase itself, critical race theory, has become a football. And of course, even Ibram Kendi is walking back from the phrase critical race theory, which is just hilarious, as he's cited by the U.S. Department of Education under Biden as one of the ways in which schools could introduce critical race theory and thereby earn Biden grants. That policy is on hold because so many people objected to it that the Department of Education is now having to go back through all of those notice and comment period and respond, and it's going to take them a very long time. So that was a success on the part of concerned parents everywhere. But I really wanted to highlight a second aspect of when we look at polls like this, and this is not the only poll that shows strong majorities, although it's interesting for its racial breakdown, right? Showing that, for example, even Black parents don't necessarily want concepts like systemic racism and white privilege taught to their children. But there are polls like this that are coming out, and unless the language is manipulated, for example, they ask parents, do you want your children to learn about slavery? Well, that's really not the issue. But most of these polls that have reasonable language that actually indicate what kids are learning under these kind of umbrella of critical race theory in schools show strong majorities of parents against it, which is why we're seeing a lot of backlash from teachers, especially in states that have passed CRT bans in K-12 in terms of content, either trying to circumvent those bans by teaching the concepts under another name or in some other clever way. But fundamentally, we see this reaction from teachers saying, no, I have a right to teach whatever I want. It's my classroom, right? That, I just want to remind folks, is fundamentally not how our system works. Teachers are in K-12 as opposed to universities. There is a concept of academic freedom, both legal and cultural in universities, but there is not in K-12. So, and the Supreme Court has affirmed this multiple times, as well as the Seventh Circuit has affirmed this in recent cases from the 2000s, basically saying, no, when you're in the classroom as a teacher, you are hired speech. It is not your personal soapbox. You do not have a First Amendment right. Of course, you have a First Amendment right to put whatever you want on your Facebook or to speak to your friends or participate in any kind of political advocacy on your own time. But when you are in the classroom, you are hired speech and you do not get to teach whatever you want. The curriculum is set by the democratic institutions here, small d, which is the parents, through the local government, through the school board, and then ultimately the locus of power rests with the state government. It is not unusual. In fact, it is the norm that the state government sets and the state legislature sets what children learn in the classroom. And that is not a departure from liberal norms or whatever else. That is actually how education policy works. And the only reason that we're talking about it, and of course, all the usual suspects on the right, like David French and so on, find this to be such a huge departure from liberalism, is that we've essentially allowed the left to use this system to implement whatever they want into our public schools. They certainly introduce new curriculum items every year. But there are all kinds. I don't want to take up too much time. There are all kinds of problems. They don't always get implemented, and teachers have enormous amount of leeway, and they've gotten used to having that amount of leeway, which is why we're seeing this response. I have the right to teach whatever I want in my classroom. No, you don't. Not to other people's kids on taxpayer dime. That is not your soapbox. The classroom is not a free speech zone for teachers, and that's my little rant before I kick it out to you three.
Well, it's interesting because so much of this actually like violates anti-racism, as it's described by the left, violates our policies in this country against racism. It's like amazing. And in the same way that we don't want like actual racism, and we have decided that an appropriate use of government power is to forbid racism from being taught in the classroom. This is all you need essentially to stop teaching critical race theory. Like, it's all there, but critical race theory, as Inez says, has become a football. And that's not the right's fault. I mean, the left has all the power of every institution to conflate these definitions and inflate these definitions and make the boundaries sort of fuzzy as to what it actually is in a way that allows them to protect themselves. But at the end of the day, this is such a fascinating conversation for the right because it's sort of about our relationship with government and our approach to these really thorny, difficult subjects. But this one, I think, actually is kind of easy. This is racism. And I think that's why, to Inez's point, you're seeing parents of all races start mobilizing against it. It is naked racism. There is absolutely no room for it. And to the extent that the right can sort of coalesce around that very, very clear-cut point, this should be an easy battle, and perhaps one that has downstream consequences to the benefit of the conservative cause.
I'll just make two quick points. One is to underscore Inez's completely accurate portrayal of the interaction here between the First Amendment and classroom critical race theory, all of this, which is very straightforward here, which is that public school teachers, especially in particular, do not have some sort of like unmitigated, unqualified First Amendment right to spout whatever it is they want to spout, obviously, in K through 12. That is a farcical notion. I mean, obviously, it was largely peddled by that somewhat infamous four byline, including David French, New York Times op-ed back in July. This is just legally, I would say morally too, but legally and constitutionally, that's just simply not how it works here. Chris Rufo had this piece a few months ago where he had this wonderful line, and I don't remember the exact line verbatim, but he basically said the First Amendment does not exist to give public school teachers, who in this case are effectively government bureaucrats. And I say that, by the way, as someone whose mother is a public school teacher here. The First Amendment does not exist to protect the unqualified free speech rights of de facto government bureaucrats. The First Amendment exists to protect the citizens from indoctrination and censorship from those government bureaucrats. So it just completely just reverses the causal direction that this is actually supposed to work here. And look, my largely related second point, which is less legal and more substantive here, which is kind of just a recurring theme whenever the critical race theory concept comes up on this podcast, that I like to just say over and over again, is that the American people just are so clearly on our side on this one. And I'm happy that we're flagging now a concrete poll that shows this. And the American people are on our side because despite the decades long kind of decrease in lowercase r Republican virtue and civic efficacy and our kind of just awareness of constitutional norms and our revering of the Declaration, all that stuff is going downhill, and we can reverse it, but it has been on a generally downhill trajectory. Despite all of that, the median American in his or her core and his or her bones still intuits and understands at a very just visceral level that racism of all stripes is wrong. And when the left comes out with these just ridiculous talking points, we saw like this University of California, Berkeley, like warning a few years ago saying how like discussing America as like a melting pot is like triggering for some people. Right. And they were and apparently saying that literally saying that color blindness is a good thing now, is considered quote unquote racist because ipso facto it is not quote unquote anti-racist. But the median American just understands this is nonsense here. I mean, like Martin Luther King, obviously, the most famous line from his most famous speech, from the I Have a Dream speech, about judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That still is the American ethos. It always has been the American ethos here. The American people are with us on this issue. I'm happy we're flagging this. It should be a continuing running story for conservatives, Republicans of all stripes here, because we can win on this issue, and I think we will.
I'm heartened by the polling, and I think that the campaign against CRT itself may serve as a case study or a model for taking on progressives in a whole slew of other areas as well. I also think it's worth noting Zach Goldberg wrote really an important piece. He's a researcher, an academic for Tablet several years ago, where he showed, based on polling, that woke white elites are on many issues far more radical, particularly on racial issues, than the minorities for whom the woke white elites claim to care about the most and deign to speak for. And I think we see that reflected in the fact that these fringe issues come to the fore because elites in our institutions hold these views that are completely out of touch with the mainstream. And then they try to create the appearance of having the predominant view, when in reality, it's totally out of touch with American parents and hopefully as well teachers. Now, all that said, my one word of caution with respect to CRT and the schools more broadly is that CRT is put out now as sort of the most extreme example of race essentialism and racism masquerading as anti-racism, and also really essentially casting conservatism as racism. And so to be anti-racist, you're anti-conservative. Setting that aside, the left shifts the Overton window everywhere they can. And CRT may be the most extreme point, but if they can push towards it, obviously that will serve as a win in the long march through the institutions that we've all been experiencing. So I think it is worth keeping that in mind. And I also think it's worth keeping in mind that still, when you go to what most teachers believe in these schools, the content of the textbooks that are used, what AP tests, for example, say, the language that's used and beyond, I still would bet that the majority of history textbooks in this country in K through 12 classrooms and beyond all propagate the progressive view. And I think that's been borne out in the reporting of the likes of Stanley Kurtz and others as well. So there's still a much broader fight, which is how do you strip out root and branch the progressive doctrination that our K through 12 schools, even before you get to our universities, are dominated by. And that is a long-term fight that we have to win ultimately, because if you lose at the point of the schools where children are socialized and where they're essentially indoctrinated into certain worldviews and learn certain facts and figures or lacking facts and figures, ultimately you're going to lose long-term, and our schools are going to be social justice warrior factories. And I think that is where we are. And so while I'm heartened by maybe a win on CRT, our work only has to be just beginning for the long-term health of the country.
So let's transition now to final thoughts. We've had 4 great segments here. I'm happy to kind of get us started. So I'll just kind of open up by making the final thought that I want to make in the immigration segment, but we're running low on time. So from my perspective here, what's going on at the southern border is eye-opening for another reason as well. The American left, obviously, going back around the time of the Immigration Nationality Act in like the 1960s, around that time, there was kind of a quote unquote protectionist, kind of like pro-labor segment to the left that believed in limited immigration. Bernie Sanders was literally saying this as recently as the 2016 Democratic presidential primary, right? I think he said something along the lines that have, quote unquote, not verbatim, but like, quote, you can't have open borders. That's a Koch brothers idea, right? As I think exactly what Bernie Sanders said. That segment of the Democratic Party and progressives and leftists in general America has all but completely vanished here. I can personally name a few people on the left who believe that, but it has just been completely supplanted by a de facto open border stance. And I think that largely is due to reasons of intersectionality and kind of the intersectional hierarchy and this notion that flooding America with immigrants for the multi-ethnic, multiracial sake of flooding America with immigrants is ipso facto inherently a good thing. Like, it is literally good to diminish the quote unquote white percentage of America as a percentage of the populace for census purposes, all of that, which is ugly in and of itself. The left loves to think along racial lines. And of course, as conservatives who, believe in the Declaration and Martin Luther King and all that, we choose to be colorblind. But there is also a segment of the left that I think supports these open borders amnesty regimes, because they try to take kind of a liberal humanitarian high ground here. They think that it is like the humanitarian thing to do. And again, it's not a new topic to this podcast, but I just want to emphasize and underscore here in final thoughts how just completely backwards this line of thought here is. Mass illegal immigration and amnesty and open borders are among the most anti-humanitarian policies that exist anywhere in the world here. All that these policies do, all that ending the Remain in Mexico policy and strong deterrence policies like that do, is embolden and incentivize these horrendous, murderous, transnational drug cartel organizations, Sinaloa and all the organizations like that, to just get there and put the coyotes on the ground and go down to Central America, even kind of northern South America, and shepherd these poor people on the false hope, or possibly not false hope, that they will be given amnesty and asylum in the United States. And they are treated horribly. They are put in these horrific trains, in these cattle provisions. Obviously, there's been lots of reporting. The New York Times was mild credit, had a big report on this, on sexual violence and mass rape of female migrants who experience this. And in addition to the migrants themselves, of course, there is the concrete humanitarian cost of open borders on Americans who live along the border here. Daniel Horowitz has been writing about this for years here. Ranchers along the Arizona, New Mexico, the Texas border, they wake up in the middle of the night to gunshots, to gang violence, to dead human remains from the cartels littered along the streets along the Rio Grande Valley here. It is a humanitarian catastrophe, to say nothing, of course, of getting in kind of like labor economics and kind of all the oil and gas stuff and making kind of an economic based argument in favor of reduced immigration. But just at a pure humanitarian level here, this notion of open borders is like the way to go. Is just totally backwards. So just want to get that off my chest there.
Well, my final thought will piggyback on that, just to say it's sort of pathetic and telling how impossible it is for us to acknowledge the reality of the humanitarian catastrophe that Josh just mentioned and deal with things like actual racism being taught in our schools by, teachers who are paid with public money. We can't have these conversations anymore because they're so obstructed by the atmosphere that has been that surrounds our speech boundaries, right? Like, we cannot work through these issues as a country. And something that was once an abstract conversation about the left's kind of hypocritical approach to free speech and free expression in public or private institutions has not ever really been abstract. This is like kind of a very real world, serious consequence of those problems, is that on a policy level, on school boards, wherever it is in our bureaucracy, in these agencies that are tasked with dealing with the border, it's just incredibly difficult to bring the just and rational policy decision out, because having those conversations, because even saying the just and rational and reasonable policy solution, or presenting a spectrum of the just and rational and reasonable policy solution is a frightening prospect for many people who don't want to get canceled or don't want to deal with it. So it's like, how do we even as a country begin to deal with these things? It's no longer, it never really was abstract, but that's never been clearer than right now. And the glimmer of hope is all of the parents who have just sort of thrown caution to the wind and stood up at school board meetings. And the parallel to that would be seeing Democrats throw up their hands and say, we cannot continue to incentivize people to camp under a bridge en masse. We need to figure out a better way. And maybe it is something that aesthetically looks cruel. I'm not recommending child separation, but something that isn't, that might look painful to our voters who we've conditioned to say, anything short of opening the border wide up is racism. It's going to take the equivalent of those parents at school board meetings throwing their hands up and saying, this is racism and I will not stand for it in my child's textbooks and curriculum. That would be the equivalent. But sadly, I don't think we will see that from our political class.
I'll jump in here and say you're absolutely right about the fact that I just want to underscore the parents that are going to these school board meetings are often not Republicans. And so I want to double down on something that Ben said earlier. He's right that it's a systemic problem in the schools, that it didn't begin or end with critical race theory. Before critical race theory, there was the 1619 Project, before that and defund the police. And before that, it was social justice warrior concept. Like, the names keep shifting, but the ideology that's coming from the academy is truly systemic, the left's favorite word, in K-12 education. It's going to take a systemic solution, part of which I think has to be universal school choice and giving parents not just the ability to leave those schools, but the ability to have leverage in the schools and stay in the public schools, but to be able to have that meeting with a principal or with a teacher and say, like, look, I have 20 other parents who feel the same way. And if you're not going to actually remove this stuff, whatever you call it, from what you're teaching my child, a bunch of money walks with us, because at the end of the day, there's no way to change this very clumsy bureaucratic system without more direct consequences that give parents leverage. But the final thought that I want to wrap up with is to remember, and I think we all four agree here, these issues are actually winning issues with the American public, not just with the right. And it underlines how backwards the philosophy that is dominant, I think, only in media, in think tanks, both on the left and the right to a certain extent, right? I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm socially liberal. I don't think that's really libertarianism, but like for the sake of argument, let's call it libertarianism. That is actually the smallest part of the American political spectrum. And in fact, when those same folks say we have to have a big tent, the culture war is the big tent. The culture war issues oftentimes are those issues that can broaden the rights coalition and bring in people who maybe we disagree with on, universal health care, for example, but understand that their children cannot be taught, separated up by racial group and taught to hate each other. Like, that is actually the issues that a lot of people on the professional right are afraid to talk about because they think they're quote unquote divisive are not actually the divisive issues among the American people. So yeah, I just close with that. The culture war is the big tent. That is actually the way to build a winning coalition, in my view, against the excesses of the woke left.
I love that.
Everyone is making such profound points for their parting shots, so I fear that what I say is going to pale in comparison here. But I'll just say that I wholeheartedly agree on the idea of school choice is one area of leverage that's imperative if we're ultimately going to overcome the systemic indoctrination problem, the systemic wokeism problem that exists throughout our schools and has existed for decades. And also, I think in an analog to the issue with the administrative state, we probably need to flood the school systems, the textbook writing companies, making curriculum, school boards, other administrators and beyond. We need to have conservatives in those positions as well, or just non-progressives or anti-progressives who are pro-American and understand the point of our education system, which is to help make model citizens, not to create the next generation of social justice warriors. So wholeheartedly agree on that point. Two minor points, pivoting a little bit on the AUKUS issue. One of my concerns that I forgot to voice earlier in the exclusion of India, and I agree, by the way, with Josh, Japan ought to remilitarize, even though I don't think we're going to be the ones that convince them that they ought to do that on this show. And of course, Australia being a focus makes inordinate sense because they are the Anglosphere first line of defense with respect to China and have borne the brunt of their hawkishness or deterrent stance with respect to China. But India ultimately is going to be the key country in terms of combating communist China. It's the largest of the countries that will be deterring communist China. It shares a border with it. And the Biden administration itself has been very critical on a number of grounds of the Modi government there. And so I think it is we'll see what the rhetoric is coming out of the Quad meeting to come, I believe, this week. And then lastly, just because General Milley's name was invoked, one point that I want to make apropos of nothing is that I think the real story of Milley is that the double or triple mask of our ruling class is completely off here. Not only did Milley not deny through a spokesperson what was said to communist China, which is essentially pledging that he would serve actionable intelligence up to China on matters of war and peace without the knowledge of our president, according to President Trump and those around him. But it seems that he was proud of it, and he probably wanted it known that he leaked it at the end of the day. He said that he was making those calls they were perfectly legitimate calls, perfectly reasonable phone calls. It's not the exact quote, but that's essentially the gist of his comments. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about our ruling class. They believe it's perfectly legitimate to subvert the will of tens of millions of Americans, to go outside the chain of command, to take measures into their own hands, regardless of their duties, their charges under the law and to the American people. And I think that says it all about our ruling class. Anyone who dares dissent from their views, they believe they ought to put their own policies forth. And I think it makes a mockery of our system at the end of the day. And I wish that tens of millions of Americans would see it. But I fear they're going to listen to the other general as his comrades in arms who all say, yeah, this is perfectly reasonable, normal course business. Yeah, we're just going to go and have conversations with the Chinese behind the president's back, that we're not going to strike you. And if we were going to, I'd let you know in advance.
Well, I strongly agree with everything Ben just said. And a shameless plug note, that was basically the entire theme of my entire last column, the kind of framing laissez-faire Mark Milley as the ruling class versus the deplorable. So check that out. But we are way out of time on this podcast. So on behalf of Ben, Inez, and Emily, I'm Josh Hammer, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.